Kia ora. Is this on? I don't have a voice like yours much. Just before we begin, just some really quick housekeeping. If you've not been here before, toilets are straight through these doors towards the back, past the cafe. If we can please have no tea or coffee or food in the auditorium, that would be... No. Check. Is that on? Still not? No. That'll work soon. And in case of any events, we're all pretty good at this now. Out to the right, the car park out there is the meeting space. So welcome today to our second symposium, which we've called Compassion and Transformation. Compassion being any kind of act of care that's motivated to relieve pain or suffering. And everyone in this room, I think, is here because you're from a space that is motivated to be with people in a way that can relieve their pain and their suffering. And however big or small your responses are to that, you are working in a way that comes from compassion and has the capacity to transform somebody from where they are to where they can possibly be. And we wanted to move this korero towards, or away, if you like, from programs, away from what is it we have to do when someone walks through the door or when we engage a whānau, and we wanted to move towards what is it, or how is it that we need to be as a community of people that act with compassion. And it's an incredible privilege of mine to be able to introduce Rachel Smith and Shane Walker, who are going to be talking this morning. I will let them do their own introductions, but I've had a really fortunate experience of being able to work with both Shane and Rachel historically. I know that some of you will remember Rachel from the original ISR rollout training that we did a few years ago. So I guess without further ado, you guys are going to tag team a bit this morning. So I'm not sure who to pass this on to first.
Kia koutou. Ki te mana whenua o te rohi nei. Kaitahu ka te mamo, e waitaha hoki. Tēnā koutou. Tēnā koe, Matthew, me tō korero, me tō korowai aroha, me tō karakia, me tō whakatau, mo te hui nei. Tēnā koe e hoa, me tō rōpū nei. Kia ora. On behalf of Rachel and I, and Blair, we want to thank you for giving your time today for this. We have some understanding of how hard it is to get away for things like this. And so this day is predominantly for you, because we think that system change and long-term change starts with us. And so we're not here today to give you silver bullets or provide a whole lot of answers, but we are here to stimulate thought, and we are here to learn some things with you and from you. And hopefully we will impart some things that are useful to you. I just want to acknowledge all of the people that have taught us what we know. You and I have all learned things on the basis of other people's misery. You think about some of the hard lives that people have had, that we have had the privilege of working with those people. And some of our best lessons have come from them, human to human. Aroha ki te aroha, nākau ki te nākau, mātauranga me te mātauranga, no te whānau ne. And so we come with this in our hearts and in our minds, And please, today, pull us up. If you think something is bollocks, then please say so, and we'll korero about it. And some of you are going, what the heck has love got to do with professional family or whānau violence work? Actually, I think it has everything to do with it. And more than anything, you know that. And so we are taking that as a starting point. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. Iho, thank you for arranging this. I hope you're not sorry for having us. Kia ora. And by the way, if we say anything that is discreditable or bad, and me te whare karakia, I am going to work my best not to swear, because I'm in a church. But actually, I think in swear words. Imagine if all your emotions are just a set of swear words. And then you end up working at a uni. You have to translate back into proper words. But actually, the people we work with, that's them. A number of them think in swear words. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Hara mai, Rach.
Kia ora koutou. I think we're going to need two mics because we're just going to work together. It's a privilege to be back here, to be learning from all yourselves, and I feel a bit of a fraud standing up here talking about compassion and transformation when it's yourselves that are doing this work every day. I used to work for the Family Violence Death Review Committee, and that was a privilege to understand people's life histories, histories of trauma, of pain, of suffering, but actually what we hear about today is patterning of hope. And so we're here to understand that if we don't, as Shane was saying, start with ourselves, there can be no transformation. I think we often use the language of transformation, which has sometimes been co-opted from social justice, but then we don't do the social justice actions. And so today is really also acknowledging where a lot of these concepts and thinking came from a lot of our social justice activists who have suffered the pain of actually standing up for what's right in this world. And so we are just going to be starting now, and so please.
And we will interrupt each other, so you feel free to interrupt us, because we'll be interrupting each other. And I mean that. I used to have a clause in classes I used to teach years ago, which was called a bull something clause. And if something thought it was that, they would put their hands up and go, oi! And often I would tell a lie in class or misinterpret a fact just to see if they were awake. And a number of times they would call it. So please, if you need to call something, please do. You come here with experience. You come here with mana. You also come here with deep compassion. Kia ora.
So you'll probably recognise Martin Luther King, and when we were invited to do this talk, I thought we've spent so much time in the family violence sector talking about power and control. We've got so many power and control wheels. I'm not necessarily a fan of those, but what we really need to be talking about is power and love. And one of the most insightful ways of thinking about power and love is from Martin Luther King. Power without love is recklessness and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. And so when we're thinking about these two concepts, power and love, power is that drive to assert ourselves, and love is often that drive which we're trying to unite, make whole all what is fragmented. But often what I find, particularly I've done a lot of work within government, is we don't actually acknowledge the different power differentials in the room. And so when we're coming together to try be collaborative and transformative, we're not acknowledging our different positionalities. So actually, who holds the power when we're talking about money? So how do we be good partners when we're talking about NGOs and government? And so actually to do this work, we have to acknowledge those different forms of power, or else we're not going to be able to move forward. And so that's one of the things that we'll start with, is talking about some of those high-level system forms of power that actually shape the way we have to work, and thinking about what actually needs to change at the government level and other levels to enable different ways of being.
But I'll pose a question first. And this cuts to the core of power. Some of it is shaped by the organisations we work in, but other parts of it actually come down to us. I want you to turn to your neighbour if you don't know them, introduce yourselves, and I want you to respond to this. How do you respond to someone telling you to get effed? And I mean in the strongest terms. Excuse me. But I think you'll agree with the sentiment with where I'm going with this. How do you respond to that? Please, talk with your neighbour. When someone tells you to get effed, what's your response?
Oh, no, that's fine.
Well, I just thought,
Sorry, I feel like
No. For me, it cuts to the notion of power and control. Okay. Hey, look, I love it when we get some noise going. We're going to get plenty of this going. But anyway, and please, this is not a I see that hand, brother or sister kind of thing. This is a, I have to behave. This is more a, your responses. What are some of your initial responses to that statement? And I'm sure it's been said to just about everyone in the room. I've had it followed with spitting as well. So, what's your response? Normal day's work? Yep. What else? I hear your frustration? Yep. Do you have a tissue? Anything else? Are you okay? Yeah. Okay, yep. Bring some humor in. Yep. Who has a personality that wants to throw petrol on the fire? Whose natural personality is to go, no, you get beat. You think you're big enough for that? Go to blazes. I didn't come this far for that. Now, I am that person. But professionally, and a number of you have already got right onto this, professionally, I understand my role. My role is to try and de-escalate it through using a number of different things. And the first part that starts with that is I remember when someone asked me what kind of young people I wanted to work with, I say, well, I automatically start with the people who tell me to get beat. They're the people I want to work with. And it comes down to how we view them. And then how we share power in that situation, because our response to that statement or action that goes with it actually, to me, speaks right through to the levels of power that we work under. But ultimately, how we interpret them and what we do with them is down to us. How many of you have had a look at Pedagogy of the Oppressed? Now, this is an old book for some of you now. Have any of you ever read it? You read it? How long ago? Yeah. A couple of summers ago, I decided to reread it because I was looking for some fire in my belly. And back in the 90s, when I was learning a whole number of things, especially being strong in tino rangatiratanga and things like that, I read Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and for me it was all about conscientization and revolution and all that kind of thing. And I completely missed the reason he wrote the book. And when I read it this time, this is what I read. From these pages, I hope at least the following will endure: my trust in people and my faith in men, and I think he would say women, who are still here, and in the creation of a world in which it will be easier to love. And I think we are part of a system that is trying to work with society in a way where it becomes easier to love. And what is a system? It's a group of people who work with particular technologies in particular ways. We are all part of that. And so for me, the debate in terms of how we change that is a philosophical one. And so I think love, or aroha, and by the way, I don't think aroha means the same thing as love. And so I don't use those terms interchangeably. I think aroha has a whole number of other things that go with it. And for me, if you want to work in an absolutely professional sense, I'm not saying become warm and fluffy and go up to everyone and go, oh, kia ora, it's good to see you. I'm not that kind of guy. I'm not a huggy guy. And I'm not like that emotionally. She doesn't like that space either. Do you know what I mean? What I'm saying is do the best possible job we can for the people who are with us. And that, to me, is about love.
So really, in essence, what we're saying today, if we want to transform the system, then actually you need to transform the people, because it's people and changing their capabilities who will actually create the change that we want to see. But so much, and I reflect on a lot of the talks that I've done before, we often have made the people who are experiencing violence and those who are affected the object of our inquiry. And so often we don't actually turn that gaze back on ourselves and actually think, what do I need to change if I'm going to be able to seed power, if I'm going to be able to contribute to practicing in a completely different way? And a lot of the ways that we are quite deeply embedded, how we work, how we think, and a lot of the hierarchies that we have in place, particularly in government, actually can dehumanize the way we behave and relate to each other. And so today is really about turning that gaze back on ourselves and thinking, what do I think about violence and how am I acting in a way that's going to be transformative? And this is a great book. If anyone wants to read anything, Good Power and Love, it's by Adam Kahane, and he's done a lot of work in post-conflict situations and trying to bring groups of people together who don't like each other, who don't trust each other, and who are often enemies. But we're thinking about how do we actually work collaboratively, and I think some of our ways of that have been very romanticised, about like how we think about love. And so it is a reflection on ourselves, and as I say, when I say ourselves, I'm including myself. And so when I was putting a lot of these slides together, I thought, that's how I act. I'm the debater. I'm not presencing. So this is as much about me as it is a conversation about how we are together.
Ko au, ko koe, ko koe, ko au. I am you, and you are me. I love this notion of shared meaning making. And by the way, I use the term shared meaning making, originally comes from Charles Waldegrave's work, if you need a reference for it. But I love it because I said earlier, most of the best lessons I've ever learned in practice have been from the people I have worked with. And it comes down to what you fundamentally think about humans. I was at an institution in Germany once, and I'll be very quick. I was at an institution in Germany called Lübetal. It has 860 patients that have varying degrees of ability or disability. And it's the largest institution in Europe for that group of people. Well, anyway, a friend of mine is their treasurer and accountant, and he gave us a key and said, go anywhere you want, look at anything. Just introduce yourself to the people first and make sure that it's okay with what they're doing. Well, anyway, I went into this room, and there were 4 young people in that room who had locked-in syndrome. Do you know what I mean? So everything is functioning, but their mode for communication, because no hands, no, just here. And anyway, I walked in, and there was this young guy on the other side, and he was there, and his mum, by the way, he had been there since birth, and his mum had been there every 2 weeks since birth, doing his hair, all that kind of thing, and often every day. And then, as she was doing this, I was looking at him, and then this woman walked in. And she walked in, and as she was walking towards him, his eyes just went nuts. And I thought, what is that? And she just started talking with him and communicating with him. And he was communicating with her very directly, and all he had was his eyes. And so when they had had that initial greeting conversation, I said to her, "How long have you cared for him?" She said, "I have cared for him with his mother since birth." And I said, "You love him, don't you?" She said, "Yeah, I do." And I said, "I can't train social workers to do that." I said, "I've been trying my whole life to teach that." And I said to her, "It is the joy of my life to be here with you and to see that." My lesson is this: if you choose to, you can learn something off anyone, and you can co-construct something with them. And this person just had their eyes, but their bond, their work, just stunning, by the way. And I won't continue that story. I have a lot of stories to go with that one. But I love this comment here by Lilla Watson. "If you have come to help me, then you're wasting your time." And by the way, I went to a tangi a couple of years ago, and it was like dividing up the do-gooders and the whānau. And so at the back on the right-hand side were all the government people, the do-gooders, all that kind of stuff. And on this side was the whānau. And what was really weird was it was the whānau that said that. And I thought, that's odd. And so I thought, well, where am I going to stand? And then one of them came and grabbed me and said, "No, bro, you're here with us." And I thought, what's that about? And for me, it was, if you've just come to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, let us work together. And that, for me, is a philosophical no-brainer. If we think we go to people and we've got the answers for them, I don't think so. Our people are very good at smelling bull, that word. They are. When you think about all the people that have worked with the people that you work with, they have antenna for disingenuous behavior. They have antenna for those cheesy smiles that go, "Oh, how are you?" When actually you know they don't care. They can sense it. I certainly can. And when I am being like that, I'm so pleased I'm married to a woman who calls it every day. I love her to bits, but boy, she doesn't hold me anywhere on a pedestal, because she knows that I need an ass kicking every now and then. We all do. We need to be accountable to people to call us out, so that the people we work with know that we truly have their liberation in mind, because we know that the freedom they get also provides a freedom for us.
I should mention that Shane told me he's limiting himself to 20 minutes these days, but we don't want to limit you, Shane. So I guess I'm speaking from a government space sometimes, having worked in government, and I think it's really important for us to think about how we keep power, how we share power, and how we cede power. Because actually, government has a very good history of keeping power. And I don't know if people recognize that language of new public management, but it's what came in the 1980s, when they needed to make the public sector more business-like and more efficient, and everyone was a customer. So we're talking about transactional practice. And this is sort of what was a very big driver for a lot of our public service in our public sector. And so we often value efficiency and effectiveness and all these words that are like machines. And people are not machines, and we've based a lot of our Western thinking on industrialized notions of engineering, of linear systems, and we have all the sort of words that go with it. And this is profoundly problematic, because if we're trying to be transformative, then we need to be up at the seeding power. But to seed power actually means that we will have to think completely differently about the way that we relate with our partners, with our NGOs, with our community members, and actually we're going to need a whole new set of capabilities often, because a lot of our ways of working is actually for keeping power. And so how often I might be reading something, a good example is, we often think from a Western framework, how adaptable is this to other communities, rather than thinking about let's actually use Indigenous evidence bases and make sure things actually are right for the people, rather than adapting Western frameworks. So we're very good at the keeping power, and it can happen in quite subtle ways. A lot of the activity, we do quality improvement, and that might be language which people see in the organisations. You know, how can we make things more efficient? How can we make things more effective? And I think what this actually does is it removes the human nature from us. And actually, efficiency is often the opposite of what we're talking about, because to do this work well takes time. You can't. I've often worked in health, and I know trying to introduce family violence screening into healthcare, people say we've only got 15 minutes if you've got a GP appointment, and I think the problem is we can't always squeeze it into 15 minutes. We're going to have to change the way that we work. If someone needs an hour, then we're going to have to create the space where the person has an hour to tell you what's actually happening for them. And so these are quite big challenges when we're talking about trying to change the way that organisations work and the way that we are working with others. And so a lot of today we're going to be thinking about how do we get to that seeding power, and what might that actually look like from where you are working, who you're working with in your own organisations, or the ways that you're being. And so there's quite different language. So here we talk about customers and keeping power, and customers and clients and all those sorts of quite transactional words. Up here in seeding power, we're going to be talking a lot today about allies. How are we good allies to other organisations? How are we good allies as Pākehā to Māori? How are we good allies to each other as colleagues? Because being an ally is very different to being a customer. And so we're going to be talking about what it means to be transformative rather than transactional, but recognising that from Western ways, a lot of our ways of being have come from keeping power approaches. That's in government. Sorry, did you want to?
I just, and I'll keep this, and we'll come back to this, but I want you to be thinking about this. How do you actually share power? How do you do human rights and social justice on a daily basis? We're going to come back to it, but I don't want to know what you philosophically think. I want to know what you do. Should we do it now?
So I think it's like actually with some people around you, maybe go meet some other people, think about what does keeping power look like and how you see that, and what would sharing power, what are you doing around sharing power, and what would seeding power be like in the context that you're working?
And how does a person know you're sharing power with them? How do they know? What do you
descriptive.
Look for? What's in your behaviour? What's in their behaviour that lets you know, yeah, man, we're all getting off on this. Come on, please, into it.
That is one I feel like
say, yeah. What did you end up having? Oh, nice. Yeah, how old is he now?
16 months. He's fully charged. His father believes he's going to start daycare this week. His father's thinking, something else.
And you just
He's going to.
good luck with that. You've got a 3-year-old, I've got a 2.5-year-old.
Yeah, still not being funny because I still breastfeed mostly, so they're like, nap. I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
Good luck with that.
You'll be surprised. They've got people
I don't know.
Yeah. Oh, I bet he is. It'll be just total parallels apart, like from doing a week's done to being mum.
So I needed to. Yeah. Well, you can. Actually, I've got to.
Hi, I'm Kate. How are you? Nice to meet you. Hey, I'm just wondering, is there any chance we can get a printout of the...
Oh, I'll send them to Ben. Absolutely.
Because otherwise I'm going to be taking a photo of each one. Because they're all such gems.
I'll share them all. Absolutely.
Awesome.
Absolutely.
They'll be really good for my series.
Oh, good. Okay.
Okay, if we could please, what are some of the behaviours that you do that show the people that you are with, and also show yourself that you're sharing power? What are some of those behaviours? Please, jump in. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yep, challenge systems, and Rachel's going to talk about that in some later slides, about the value of philosophically fighting things. Probably one of the best examples of this I've ever seen was I heard a guy speak on George Bush's policies, and he traced 70% of his speeches back to the Chicago School of Economics out of papers that came out of that place. And so we literally had blue chip companies at war in another country based on economic policy that was espoused out of a particular university. So please keep fighting. What else? Good idea.
Great to define our words because language can mean such different things to.
I could talk to you on the break. Oh, oh my goodness. All right. I butt up against this frequently in the work that I do, where the people that come in looking for what we provide have found that they've been left out of the loop in terms of communications, or that there's been a level in which professional organisations have conducted their work about that person without including that person in the work. And so when they come to us and say, this is what has happened, and I don't know what happened here, and I don't know why this happened, I don't understand what's going on here, then part of my role is to either challenge that system and say, actually, what's going on here, and why does this person know this information, and why did this happen in such a way that they were left out of that loop, and or support them to challenge that system themselves, to give them put them broker a contact with someone within that system that will be able to communicate with them. So that's part of it.
Kia ora. Kia ora. By the way, the research worldwide at the moment on children and care, whether you look at our own inquiry here, or whether you look at Scandinavia, they're coming up with the same answers. And those answers are, children and young people want good information. And adults are exactly the same. If you don't, it's just manipulation. And by the way, it's the worst use of cognitive behavioural I've seen in this country. When people are using it and not doing it in a way where we're honest with the people we're doing and going, look, this is what I've been thinking about. You know, what do you think about this? You know, other than that, it's manipulation. Young people are also saying worldwide, not only give us good information, but include us in the decision making, and what we say must have impact. And you all know with what's happened here. But the other part of the research, especially from, say, places like Norway, is saying at the moment, show us that you love us. And they're saying that in Aotearoa as well. They're saying, show us that you love us. And one day I was at this thing being run by a Norwegian group called the Change Factory. And by the way, this is a group of young people who have been in various institutions, various forms of care. They have been advisors to the Prime Minister and Cabinet. Just stunning access. And they have this mission, which is to rehabilitate the systems that have worked with them. And so they're about 10 or 12 years ahead of Voice Whakaronga Mai here, because they're still finding their feet in these things. But anyway, this woman had just presented, and I said to her, I'm not getting this. And she said, you must have heart warmth. And I was thinking, heart warmth? Exactly what is that? And I'll leave that up to you, but the final thing I said to her was, I said, look, I'm from Aotearoa, New Zealand. If you could give me one thing I can take home with me that makes me remember everything that has been said here today, could you please say it? And by the way, this woman had been in a psychiatric institution. Her thing to get attention was to smash windows with chairs or smash chairs on people. And by the way, one day a social worker just let her do it, and then went up to her and said, hey, why are you doing this? And she went, no one's ever asked me that. By the way, that was the turning point for her. She talks about it. Amazing. But anyway, the one thing she said that I should bring back to this country was this. She said, you must have warm eyes. And I love that. There's something, and especially because I'm Māori and we say hello like this, you know, we do a whole lot of things with our eyes, but so does everyone else in this room. And I ask you, how do the people in front of you know you've got those warm eyes? And you do want to share power. I'm going to shut up.
No, please don't. We just feel I've got the boring job pushing the button. But anyway, so the reason I'm labouring some of these points is there'll be different people sitting in the room. Some will have roles in funding and commissioning. Some will have roles doing...
One thing. We're giving you the slides.
Oh, yes, sorry, I was meant to say that. Absolutely, the slides are being shared. So
stop copying furiously. Okay?
yes, sorry, I should have said that. I actually meant to say that before. And so one of the things I think that has been problematic with a lot of our systems thinking is that it has been modelled on these mechanistic engineering kind of concepts. And really what we need to be looking at is organic, social ecology. And that's what we should be modelling, how we live as part of an ecosystem, because that's what's going to actually enable us to be transformative. And so a lot of the way that we have engaged, whether it be often transactional with partners, if we're talking about government, has been in this new public management approach. And we've had all these ideas of how we create outcomes and people will be measured against the outcomes. And we haven't thought about that actually one program, one service, they can't create the outcomes that we're wanting. We all are responsible for those, but we don't have good ways of actually understanding how to measure because we're so obsessed with measurement. And so I think what we need to be moving to is thinking about how are we co-creating outcomes across all the different people that are working in an area. And that's far more difficult because, as I say, we often revert to what's our comfortable area and what we can count and what we can measure. And we miss all the other nuance, which is what is the meaning making. And so I won't go through all these because you'll be able to read them on the slides, but it is, we've got to move away from best practice because best practice is always past practice. And so we need to be thinking actually about what works in this context and why. And so these are the sorts of things that we need to be thinking about if we're really going to start seeding power. So just, if we're thinking, what's the role of a commissioner? Actually, roles of commissioners and funders is about the health and well-being of the whole system. So how are we building good relationships, networks, rather than thinking about how do we give money to make sure a certain outcome is met. And I know that these are difficult things, and thinking about roles of organisations, are they partners or are they service providers? And what do those two different words mean? I mean, I'm just thinking, if I think about in my own relationship, if I was to introduce do you introduce a partner or, a service provider? So very different context. You see how strange it sounds in that context? I didn't mean it like that, but what I'm just saying, in that context, it sounds completely out of place. It should sound out of place when we're talking about our NGO partners. And so one of the other things I think about is we often talk about accountability, and we've spoken, I have a real problem with the word accountability because we always talk about holding perpetrators to account. And so we're always asking individuals to be accountable for their behaviour when often we're not accountable for ours. And we're not necessarily accountable for the harms that a lot of people have experienced. And so we talk about, vertical accountability but not horizontal. How are we accountable to each other in the ways that we're working? That's a very, very different conversation to being accountable to a funder. And so I won't go more into this, but I think some of these conversations, I know from my work across different areas, they are really important, because if we're talking about sharing power, then we need to be moving from here right over to here. And that's going to take time. And as I'm saying, that's about changing, coming down often even our own work as being an expert to be with people in the room. And it's the same when we're talking about organisational power. And so simply, this is old power, which is hierarchies. And I don't know how many of your organisational charts look like that. So if I was to come to your organisation and say, please introduce me to your people, does it look like that? Or does it look like that? So I think often we have these ways of, in what way does the power flow? How many people do you have to get something signed out from? And so I think we're not talking about people wanting to behave in these ways. It's often the context that we're in and the hierarchy and the organisational structure that can dehumanise us. It makes us behave in ways that we probably wouldn't want to be behaving in. Whereas over here, that's a relational approach. And so that's going to need very different forms of power and control. And so how do we shift from power and control to be relational and reflexive? So I think take that away and just think about your own organisations. I'm not necessarily saying they're all hierarchies, but often we put our people into those hierarchy maps. I know that looks similar to a lot of the organisations I've worked in. And so really when we're talking about transformation, we can't talk about individuals, we're talking about the collective. And we're absolutely, if we're really thinking about where transformation comes from social justice, we are talking about repatterning our current way of being. And so that needs to be socially and politically, we need to be thinking very, very differently. And we don't need to talk in this room about the extreme levels of inequity that we have in this country, about how this country is founded on the violence of colonisation, how we often don't talk about a lot of these different layers of violence. I know, we often talk about family violence, but how can we only talk about family violence if we're going to be transformative and not talk about other forms of violence? So that's what we're going to start to think about, is even in our own sector or sectors, how does some of the way that we think about violence actually limit our ability to actually share power and seed power and to see that transformation? And so what we are wanting yourselves to do with people around you now is think about, what does transactional forms of power look like? and what does transformative relationships look like? So I'll put a couple up here for Shane to talk to, and then we'll get you to fill in the gaps.
So we're talking about, instead of going into relationships with self-interest, and it is a factor, but it shouldn't be the main point. Looking at how we achieve mutual interest, and that takes some time. I remember once I said to a couple of ministers, I said, look, some of the people you're sending out representing your interests don't know how to be good partners, and they don't want to be. And I said, so if you hear anything bad about me when I call their behaviour, because I think sometimes people need to be shown how to be good partners. I don't just assume that someone turning up with a whole stack of money and saying we want to do this with you knows how to be a good partner. And most of these things, by the way, I learned from young people. I once had a young person say to me, I said, look, can I just take some notes? Because I just met him, picked him up off a bus at midnight, and it was an emergency placement from Invercargill. And I said to him, bro, I just need to write a few things down before we settle in. And he just looked at me and said, what the beep gives you the right to think that you can walk inside my head? Beep off until you've earned the right. It's a great comment. I've never forgotten it. And so I always think about how I am going to walk around inside people's hearts and heads. And I make sure that I am not treading on things that absolutely rip them to shreds, because I don't know how to be a good partner. And so instead of going into it with what we're going to get, starting from a point of what we can give, what we can learn, and to view them as people that have their own capital, that are their own theorists. I view whānau now as theorists about their own lives, because I'm sick and tired of the way that their stories are relegated to this kind of story, and everyone believes the psychologist or the social worker or whatever, whereas I think that their whānau capital is far more valuable, because in the end, after 5 o'clock at night, that's what they're going to work with to work through those issues. That's where their strategies come from, and yet we don't even take the time to understand it and know it. So, what the transactional relationships look like, for me, they're just turning up, and it's almost like saying, oh, this is my job, I have to do it. But transformative relationships have got some other elements. See if you can put it together. First beside you,
That juxtaposition didn't work. I was trying to show how straight it, then I realised what people thought anyway.
How are we doing for time?
Oh, we're fine. We've got half an hour, so we're fine. We're fine. Really.
We'll stop and labour this one. And
Yeah,
then,
absolutely.
And then I can take my time with that.
Yep.
No, I thought you were meaning the guy from... No, but I didn't need to. I've seen him interviewed, and I saw the 60 minutes thing on him. Oh, I think highly of him. I think he's cool things for what they are, and you know, locals have kind of come out to...
We're giving you our custom, you know, come up and have dinner with us, because actually, when we also want you to know that, well, my son, that's why I'm moving back in Wellington, because he was, and they call him a nigger, because it's actually, driving violence. And so it was just, and it's so racist, and so that's why I guess it's interesting, because I was doing some work pro bono for one of the collaboratives down there, and I went and met with Naropi.
Yeah.
resilience is asking people to accept what is unacceptable.
Yeah, yeah.
Because that's what you're asking young people.
Yeah.
Be resilient, even though you've been abused. It's like, why should I be resilient?
But that's why I like the people that tell you to get effed. Because they get it.
Oh, that's what they're all about at the moment.
Okay, some ideas. Ladies and gentlemen, some ideas. What are some of the things that go with, firstly, transactional relationships? What are some of the things that you can identify that go with that? Trust? Sometimes, because I wished it never came out of my head, but I once said to someone, this is my job. I have to do this, as if I was saying, actually, I don't really like what I'm doing or how I'm doing it, but this is what I'm paid for. I once had a manager say to me, I don't pay you for that bit of your time, I only pay you for this bit of your time. You know? So I think trust has got a lot to do with it. What else? Warm heart? See, now we're getting on to transformative stuff, actually.
I was going to say, I think people thought transformative, not transactional.
Yeah. So, look, I think I draw a clear distinction between transactional relationships and transformative ones. And this has been an absolutely valuable approach when I am working upwards with bureaucrats and especially ministers and things like that. But also, it has been something I learned from young people in whānau that I've worked with. So, instead of just staying in touch, keep people fully informed. So not just a phone call every 2 weeks. And by the way, they should not have to call you to catch up. The number of times I am with whānau and they say, I've been trying to get hold of someone, I've called them 6 times. You know, that's not treating that relationship with respect. So keep people fully informed. And if you have a good relationship with them, you have earned the right to say harsh things. You have earned the right to do the hard yards. People won't take that stuff from people who don't develop the ground for it to take root, but they'll take it from people who have. So, in a transactional relationship, when you talk about process, often it's just an understanding of, oh, this is what we did. And by the way, I've seen Māori things co-opted in this way really quickly. Oh, we had a karakia and we had a waiata, then we got on with it. You know, as if rubbing noses and taking your shoes off at the door makes you any better with those humans. Please. We're a wee bit more sophisticated than that. And if you think that gets you over the line, they'll just let you know. You see, they understand that. So understand the person in the process and examine that with them. And it's really interesting, the number of times when I have done this, and you actually learn a complete different understanding of what you thought had just happened. And so please take the time for it. And in transactional relationships, especially because a number of us have job descriptions which prescribe particular things that we are supposed to be doing, we like to judge the results. For me, now I try to judge the relationship. Is that person going to be ashamed to see me when I see them at the league? Is that person, Dunedin, by the way, is a small town. And so I bump into people I work with all the time. And am I going to be able to bump into them and go, kia ora, and actually mean it and not feel ashamed? So I think evaluating the relationship is important. And where the tūtai really hits the fan is on the next one. Yeah, this is real tūtai hitting the fan stuff. Conflict. And by the way, if you are going to do something that means behaviour is changing, you almost have to have conflict. People don't go, oh yes, I'm going to stop drinking and just, no, there'll be no more violence. I'll just go and do that. Oh yes, thank you. I don't know what planet you came from, but I've never seen that. People will start talking about all the reasons why they are so messed up. And they'll start saying, you know, I'm like this because of this. And we we have this conversation and this empathy, and we listen, and we become part of that conversation with them. But that's not the main point. There's a whakatauki, we're at the end of it. And by the way, it's said to you if you're being told off. And that's how I learned it. A kaumātua told me off. And it was, at the end of this whakatauki, it basically says, when knowledge is gathered, wisdom should follow. And we can know a lot, but how the people we work with measure it is by what we do. So instead of winning conflicts, we work as hard as we can to resolve it and come up with something that is mutually understood and beneficial. And when you are talking about, for instance, someone who's earning a living dealing drugs or something like that, or someone who says, oh, normally I don't work with the mud races, but you're here now. Seriously, been said to me. You have to take that in its context. And some people would go, mud races. But actually, and by the way, my initial reaction was that. Everything in me as a teenager just was wanting to get into that. But actually another part of me goes, now how do I engage? How do I make this work? So, instead of just getting agreement, and this is where real change really cuts the mustard for me. If you want long-term change that doesn't happen when you're not there. See, I'm after results where people, I don't have to be there, and where hopefully at the end of it, they go, we did this, or they did this. And, every now and then a thank you's nice, but actually, it's not the main point. The main point is that they get on with their lives. And so, instead of just agreement, I want acceptance. And I want them to go, okay. And so, by the way, in my whānau, my role is the ass kicker. Okay, so when we are organising something, or when we have a tangi and all that kind of stuff, everyone knows I have permission to ring and go, have you done this, have you done this, have you done this, have you done this? And then one of my aunties will ring me and go, Shane, have you done this? Because we accept that that is how we are operating to do this. Often we'll evaluate results, and I think especially in new public management, when we're looking at outcomes all the time, we want these kind of squeaky clean kind of results. But I think whānau still together and bitching is a great result. Now, some people kind of think, And by the way, I had to teach a government department how to put that in a computer as an outcome for their computer program. And the guy was having a fit. And I said, look, these people are still together. They're working on the best they possibly can to love each other, but they're still fighting. You're dreaming if you think that fighting's going to go away just like that. And so start to evaluate how they feel about what they're achieving. And get into that space where there is real honesty in that. Because some of the real currency for me in terms of their capital has come from the steps that they make incrementally, and they own themselves. And I have to tell you that for me, just about everything goes out the window for that bit, because I just love it when they come into their own freedom, their own beauty, and their own fullness. I want you to think about this. If someone is not going to smash people over, what are they going to be? Who are they going to be? Do we think about that? Do we dream for them in those ways? I have to. One of the things I've had the privilege of is I've been the best man at a number of weddings for people half my age. So they're often people I've worked with. And when I stand and talk, you don't, often a best man will stand and tell a story about something stupid that happened, or blah-de-blah-de-blah. But generally I stand and talk about young men that I've seen learn how to love deeply and learn how to be loved. And that I now sit at their feet and I am learning from them. And to me, that's a stunner. So, to summarise it, if you want power over, then be honest about it and let the people know that's what you're up to. But actually, if you want to be an ally, you will figure out how to share power with them. And this is not as easy as it may sound. Sharing power has a lot to do with our lenses, how we are thinking and feeling that day. One of the things that my wife and I have as an agreement is we don't let the sun go down on our anger. If I've done something dumb, which is highly likely, we discuss it that day so that we do not hold grudges. And it's a biblical thing, by the way, that's where it comes from, but it was a great way for us to keep accounts. And so when I am working with people and I've done something dumb, please own it. And just say, look, I'm sorry. By the way, I know a social worker who was asked 3 times to take her shoes off at the door. There was shoes everywhere outside. There was a sign saying, please take your shoes off. And then the woman rang me, because she was one of my students, and she said, look, this social worker is really offensive, Shane. And I said, look, she's a great social worker, but this is an absolute blind spot. I said, tell her to take them off or F off. I said, just be very clear. And the woman, she just kind of, I'm sorry, I didn't understand that it was so offensive. And it was amazing, the way they developed the conversation over that. And by the way, I know the social worker really well. I spoke at her retirement. So if it was a child protection issue, I'd want her in my corner as a pit bull for my whānau, because she would be vicious on their behalf. But in other things, she needs some work, and she knows that. So power with, figure out how to share power with people. And so when you've got government people coming to see you, just ask them, and how are you going to share power with me? You will floor them. Seriously, just ask them. Those people who sign the checks, how are we sharing power here? And you'll soon know what they're made of. By the way, for those of you in the room who are funders, good luck with that one. Is this the story?
This is Shane.
Oh, yeah. This story comes about as a result of several courses that I ran with young men. We had an issue in Dunedin that they have all over the country. 1 in 3 relationships doesn't last more than 10 years now. And so the idea of families reconstituting, the idea of people no longer with their long-term partners. And so anyway, I started running courses that were mandated by a judge who was sending young men to me and saying, you have to do this course before I will grant access to your children. And so you can imagine how compliant they were when we first started. And it was definitely a I have to be here thing. And by the way, initially my wife and I trained as P5 coordinators, that kind of thing. So we had done a little bit of training and parenting courses, that kind of thing. But I soon learned that it just wasn't appropriate. And so my first group was about, I think there were 9 guys in that group altogether. And we ran a number of them years after that, building on what we'd learned. But I gave them a scenario and I said to them, next time you're at the warehouse and your child goes to grab all the sweets and everything, how do you feel about that? And guess what? All of them said, every one of them, they all said the same thing. Think of the scenario, the sweets at the counter, grabbing for the sweets. How do you feel about that? Guess what their answer was? Sorry? Anger? Yep. Embarrassment? Yep. But actually, they did. They all said, I would do this. Boof. And so they did feel those things, but they didn't have language for identifying them. And so one of the things we kind of clicked onto was that there were fundamental emotional, logical gaps in their languaging. And so we came, and I apologise for this again, we came up with a continuum of pissed offedness. Because I realised that the only language they had was beeped off, that's very beeped off, pissed off, or cool. It was really just three pieces of language for emotions. And so what we did was we started adding language to those. And we started coming up with words about how those words could work. And then the next exercise that we gave them was to play in pairs with Lego on the floor. Have you ever seen adult males who have never played with Lego? It's a heartbreaker. My wife and I both had to leave the room. Grown men who had never played with a toy like that. I still think about it, and it still breaks me, because I just think we expect so much of them in terms of change, and yet we need to figure out some things with them first. So anyway, I get them on the ground, get them to make a toy or something. They'd invent something together, and then they would come back to the group, introduce their toy or whatever they had made, and the group's job was to use the language from the continuum of pissed offedness, use the positive language to praise them and praise what they had made. And there were a couple of things about it that were really hard. The guys found it really hard to start using that language to actually make it come out of their mouth, and they would say things like, bro, this feels wanky. this just, and then I'd say, what does it feel like to receive it? And initially, it was they found it really tough to receive that kind of praise. And the languaging of it started to change the way they were behaving. And so the last part of that exercise, by the way, was after we had had that whole session where everyone had introduced and praised people for what they had made and encouraged them and all that kind of thing, I said, close your eyes. I want you to imagine your child. How does it feel for someone to tell you that you're fantastic at something? How does it feel to be praised? And now think of your child and multiply it by 10,000 times, and then you'll get the impact for a 5-year-old. And so in the weekends, we banned Macca's, we banned KFC, we banned kids going to the movies and things like that, and we promoted time-building activities for relationships. And so we just started coming up with a whole lot of things that didn't cost money, but built relationships with children. The offshoot of this, by the way, was I got a call from one of their partners, and this was crazy. I kind of think now, oh my goodness. And one of their partners rang and said, "Are you showing my man porn?" And I went, "What?" She said, "Are you showing him porn?" And I said, "No, we're not." And I said, "What has brought this on?" And she said, "Because when he comes home, he's using all these nice words, and I think he just wants to get into my pants." And I said, "No, give him a fair go. He's actually trying to practice something new." Now his motivations might be a bit different, but I think he saw advantage in it. But I think she was on the money. And I think we had misunderstood that it wasn't just an exercise for communicating with children, but actually it was a relationship communicating exercise. And we widened it further as to how you speak with your mates in the league team. Yeah. So, when someone does a big hit, good on you, bro. Yeah. And some of you were going, ah! But actually, widening that language to male spaces was really important, because they started doing that stuff with each other. And in fact, the long-term outcome of it, the number of them now who I see as utterly kind of, I call them solid citizens or respectable kind of people, if that's what you're after. And by the way, I learned far more than I gave. And the lesson long term has, for me, has stayed the same. We still do it on the basis of people I've worked with in the past. I don't accept any new cases from any government agency, but if a member of a whānau that I have worked with approaches me and says, we would like to do this, my consideration of the relationship is the relationship duration is up to them. And so if they want help on something, we're gladly into it. And we just jump. And when that starts to happen, I'm back to having a supervisor, I'm back to having someone to call my behaviour, all that kind of thing. So we're not running it as a formal course. And we should have written it up. It was just really on the seat of your pants stuff. But the lessons for me long term have stayed the same. I've really started to go and be with people in terms of their own solutions. Because the whole languaging thing, I just could not believe it wasn't there. I couldn't believe that you would just react, that you couldn't identify a set of emotions. And we are saying to people, don't be violent, don't hit your kids, don't hit your partners, don't hit each other. Don't tell the policeman to get beat. And yet, we're often not building the logic for that behaviour. We're nearly there.
I think we might take a break and come back afterwards and just leave people to talk about everything that Shane's just shared, because I know that I think it's 10:30. Oh, so there's morning tea through in the second room, and I think we've got 20 minutes. So if everyone's back in here at 10 to 11, and then we'll continue. Kia ora. Welcome back, everyone. Might just wait for the last few people to come in and take their seats. I thought before we started, I just had a little bit of a reflection on what Shane was sharing with everyone before our break. And I thought probably what we don't talk enough is you're all here because you want to practice the way that Shane was talking about. But what we need to understand is what prevents us from doing that. And I think one of the things is the keeping power. And so when we think about a lot of the ways that we work with people, they can be prescribed programs. And this is how you deliver this program. This is how long it goes for. This is the evidence we have that says that this works. Well, that's actually all keeping power approaches. And part of that keeping power approaches is also our academic institutions. And so what forms of knowledge do we value? And when you're talking about transformation and social justice, it's the know-how and that practical wisdom of knowing how to be and how to relate and how to affect change. And so one of our problems is that when we talk about evaluation and what bodies of knowledge that we value absolutely certain bodies of knowledge over others. And if we start thinking about what I was saying is if we're part of a system that is interdependent, then how can I evaluate my outcomes separately from everything else that everyone else is contributing? So these are not questions we're expecting to problem solve. I'm trying to problematize a lot of our work. So it's also about, once again, we put academics up as experts over other people's ways of knowing that Shane was talking about. So I think we have conversations we need to continue having around how do prescriptive programs meet the diverse and unique needs of people, and is that the best way to affect change? And so these are the conversations that we need to continue having. I just wanted to also acknowledge, talking to Blair, that there is work happening, absolutely. Oranga Tamariki, partnering for outcomes, starting to talk about what does it mean to be a partner. And so there absolutely are seeds of intention to work differently. We just need to make sure that we've got that big horizon viewpoint of where we want to go. And so it's just thinking, how can we work more like this and less like that prescribed, what I call off-the-can approach. And that's not trying to devalue the work people are doing, and I'm not trying to undermine that, but thinking that we can't do cookie-cutter work because we know that doesn't meet the needs of people, and we can't be with people if we've got cookie-cutter approaches. And so these are the sorts of conversations we're going to have to start having. And also, as I said, this shifts people's positionality of power. And as soon as you're a professor, but there's lots of professors who act in very different ways. And I'm thinking of Leonie Pihama, who talks about the questions come from the community, and that's what she researches. And so it's just putting a little bit of thinking about how can we make sure that we have ways of working with people that actually meet their needs, not the needs of the person that is funding that program and the outcomes for the funder. And I think we're starting to see some of that, and obviously that's some of the work that you've been doing here in Christchurch that we can learn from in other areas. But these are ongoing challenges, and if we're going to talk about transformation, this is what we need to be transforming.
I've heard at different times comment made about the caseload numbers at Oranga Tamariki, and subsequently through NGO contracting, the caseloads in NGOs. And so you'll notice that Paul Nixon, before he left, as one of his kind of parting shots, said that he thought that they were getting the caseload numbers in Oranga Tamariki down to 26 families on average, but their hope was to get them down to 15. Now, if that is to happen so that people have the time to have relationships with other people that are quality and life-building for a long time, that is not just down to Oranga Tamariki. That's down to all of us. That's something that next year we as a country make a comment about. And I'm not saying this as a criticism of Oranga Tamariki. I'm saying it as a criticism of us because we have accepted that that is normal. And I just cannot see why we have accepted that. And so, please, this is not a comment against Oranga Tamariki. This is one about us saying, no, as a society, we want those workers to have the time, to have the relationships that they need so that they can do long-term transformative work. And that's why what Rachel is saying is so important. If you don't have the systemic view, and for so long, it's easy to get off on the kind of stuff that I say about working with people personally. But the smart money is seeing the long game, the structural game. Kia ora.
I just wanted to uppy what you were saying, because I think too often we can focus on the individual practitioner and we don't look at the context that people are having to work within. And so we need to change the settings, not necessarily the individuals. We don't do the work around the setting as well. And as I was saying, everyone that I've worked with from government departments, particularly in the death review work, they do that work because they care deeply, but often have to work in ways which is not allowing them to express that. And so these are the big challenges that we have. Now, I do apologise if this is illegible. So I wanted to introduce a way of thinking about transformation, and then we'll use this to think about how we understand violence in the areas that you work and see where they may be falling. So this is a model called the 3 Horizons, and all models are never perfect, and you never want to aim for perfection, but it's just trying to get us to think about where we might be now and the ways we might be behaving individually and organisationally, and what direction are they taking us. And so Horizon 1, which is the red line, that's what we often call keeping the lights on. That's our business as usual. And I think that's one of the phrases that it's so easy to slip into saying business as usual. And this is where I think of that new public management approach. We're not in a business of people's misery. We're in here to affect change. And so this is where we are in Horizon 1. And so we need to be thinking about what are we doing now? And is that just going to be taking us down that roller coaster ride to where we don't want to be? Or how are we going to get to the 3rd horizon? And so the 2nd horizon is ways of doing things differently, or what I'd say reclaiming ways of being. Because often we need to reclaim knowledges, like Indigenous knowledges that have been suppressed. And how might doing things differently either take us towards the 3rd horizon, which is that transformation, which is that seeding power, or how might it take us back to keeping the lights on, which is that managerial approach. And so often we are absorbed in our own organisational context of how we do things, that we're stuck at Horizon 1. And so if we're going to do transformation, we just can't co-opt the language. We have to absolutely start thinking radically. And so Horizon 3 should sound off the wall. So those should be the things that you think, well, we could never do that. That would never happen. And so if we're not thinking about Horizon 3 when we're in Horizon 1, then there will be no transformation. And so what I want you to think about is, what are Horizon 1's ways of thinking about violence or family violence? Keeping the lights on, business as usual. What might be Horizon 2, that sort of entrepreneurial outlook, ways of thinking about family violence, forms of violence? And what might be your Horizon 3? And just to reflect on that with people around you, because how are we going to get to Horizon 3 if we keep doing what we've always been doing and keep, most importantly, thinking the way we've often been thinking? And so what are the ways that we're going to allow new ideas or reclaimed ideas to emerge and take us to that vision? And we need to have all these 3 horizons in our minds when we work collectively together. But we know, as Shane was talking about, you get locked into the keeping the lights on when you have a really high caseload of people's lives and you end up firefighting. And I know that from myself. My background is I did a Master's in Human Rights, and then I went and worked doing frontline advocacy work in a really deprived area of London. They wanted an African Caribbean woman, and there was me, completely inadequate. And so I learned a hell of a lot, and I also learned what it's like, to have burnout, to be completely ill-equipped. I was talking to Raymond, trying to address the institutional racism. A lot of the women I was working with were Jamaican, and the Home Office, you would not accept basically any asylum claims if you were Jamaican. It was just like, well, you're lying, you're just a liar. So completely racist. And so trying to, when you're in that Horizon 1 and you're overloaded, we've got no space to be actually thinking differently. And I think this is often the problem we have, is how do we make sure we actualize those desires to practice differently? You have to create a space. But a lot of the time we don't have that space and that thinking space. Often people say to me, I don't have time to read, I don't have time to listen to that. I'm thinking, well, if we're not learning and actually learning from others, then how on earth are we going to change to get to that transformation? So I just want you to think about what keeping the lights on looks like in the ways that we think about family violence. It might be other forms of violence, and we'll come back, if that makes sense to people. And you just think off the wall for Horizon 3. It should sound radical. So how would you be behaving and practicing and organising completely differently if you didn't have these constraints of, epistemological knowledge? This is how you have to do things, the workloads. How would we be organising, and who would be our allies? I mean, how many people here work across multiple sectors? So we've got people from the sexual violence sector and family violence. How many people do anti-oppression work here as their main work? Anti-racism work as their main work. So if we're thinking about being an ally in Horizon 3, then we're missing a lot of people in this audience. And that's not a criticism of yourselves, it's just a reflection. I've been thinking a lot about actually, I've contributed to this. I used to, work for the Family Violence Death Review Committee and sort of focus on family violence, but people don't live single issue lives. So we can't have single issue understandings or responses. And so if we're going to think about the Horizon 3, I want you to think radically. I want you to think in alliances as allies and think about how we know this. We know that people are experiencing multiple forms of violence, structural violence as well as interpersonal violence, but how our response is addressing those structural violence and how sometimes, we need different responses. Like often we say, I can't stand that bottom-up, top-down analogy because it simplifies everything. And actually communities aren't responsible for addressing structural inequity. We need national redistributive policies around that. And so I just want you to take a time and just think about Horizon 1, 2 and 3 with the people around you.
Sky's the limit.
Okay, I might just bring everyone in. I know there's lots of conversations, and we're hoping that these will continue over the hour and a half lunch. So we're just sparking ideas here. I just wondered if anyone wanted to share any of their conversations. Just jump up. Oh, I'll come here and then I'll come there. Oh, no.
It's almost a little scary to go to that third horizon, because if we are allowing ourselves to dream and go for what is possible, which we all want to do, we have to be aware that if it's not resourced and there's no room to do this, we actually set ourselves up and we set the whānau that we're working with up, and we're in a worse place later on because it's taking hope. And in our role, it's all about giving hope. So it's exciting to talk about it, but also at the same time I'm thinking, but we've been here before where we've dreamed and it's not resourced, and then we feel we've got no power to make the change that we want. So how do we allow ourselves to dream with that risk in the background? Do you know?
Utterly endorse what you're saying. Every good kaupapa has a cost. Sometimes it is a resource cost. Sometimes it's our own whānau that pay for it. And so we'll come home beaten up, upset, angry, all those kinds of things. So every good kaupapa has a cost. I think in terms of who is paying the cost, that's a bigger issue. But I think personally, I always take account of when I'm away from my own whānau, am I allowing this kaupapa to steal from my moko? Because that's how they feel, you know. But back to the resourcing issue. I think philosophically as a country, we have to start dreaming about being in a country that's violence-free. You know, every year I spend 3 weeks in a country where women can go walking in a park at 3 in the morning and they are safe. There has never been an attack in the city of Stavanger of a woman at night walking a dog in the park at 1 in the morning. Can you do that anywhere in New Zealand? And yet, in several places in Norway, you can do that. Why is that? I think it's because as a country, they've understood this notion of third horizon in terms of human rights, social justice, gender equality. And it's a weird thing, you know. And I'm a dreamer by nature, but my wife will always basically say, what is this going to cost us? Because there is a cost for it. And by the way, when the idea of the ISRs was first mooted, one of the comments that was discussed at seriously high levels was, are we setting these people up to fail? Are we actually going to be able to have the delivery? Because one of the things that came out from Rachel's work especially was that people who were in trouble were really good at asking for help. They were good at coming forward. But systemically, we weren't crash hot at responding to them. And that wasn't down to an individual thing. That was a resource thing. And so, for my money, I would be making these kinds of things front and centre of what my MP is doing. Because one of the things I've learned about flying back and forth to Wellington all the time, there are a couple of ministers especially, you have to get everything passed. And so, philosophically, if you want to get it past them, there's got to be a whole lot of work done. And so, for instance, to dream about having caseloads that are down to 15, that is a broader issue where we all target our MPs. That is a broader issue where we as a society stop looking at people as screwed units and actually start remembering they're our cousins, they're our aunties, they're our uncles. We share the earth with them.
And just in response, and then I'll come over, sorry, 2 people up at the same time. I hear what you're saying about resourcing, and absolutely the constraints that are very, very real that constrain people. But I also think that often on Horizon 1, you know, and as I said, I put my hand up, I've contributed to this, I've been guilty for this, is I was reading the mental health report and thinking one of the recommendations was saying that GPs need training around mental health and addictions. And so often what we do to the front line is say, oh, you need a framework to learn about mental health and addictions, and then you need a framework to learn about family violence, and then you need a framework to learn about sexual violence, and then you need another framework to learn about how not to be oppressive in the way that you work. So for me, that is an exorbitant amount of resourcing to actually teach people how to be trauma and violence informed. And so what I think sometimes I hear you what you're saying around resourcing, but I also think how many times do we talk about silos often in governments, but we're siloed often in our own sectors in the ways that we work together. And so actually, there could be different approaches that enable quite different outcomes. And so I'm not denying that these are very real constraints, but also asking you just to think about in your own organisations or your own daily work, how could you stretch what you're doing? How could you encompass multiple ways of knowing? How could you address multiple forms of violence? And then that might just be something quite small. And so I think until we start thinking that way, we will never get there. And I believe in dialogic change because often, particularly when I was working for the Family Violence Death Review Committee, people want you to make recommendations. And I think, you know, there's times where they work really well, particularly around legislation, where you have something that's quite prescribed and you can make a recommendation. But actually, we know from social justice and social movements that change is about changing our everyday behaviours, our everyday conversations. And then if you change those, you're going to get far more momentum than something which you're trying to push down onto people and force people to behave differently. And I'm not saying that there aren't times where actually, you know, if something might be completely unacceptable, we need to, you know, actually address that. But if we're talking about power, we often don't realise the power that we have to change those conversations, to start maybe your meeting differently and thinking about, do we have a narrow view here? What is the frame of reference that I'm using? Like thinking about the edges of that frame and what is it eclipsing and what could I maybe actually include within? And so that's why I guess it's called patterning for hope. And absolutely with hope, there's always the reality that we're not going to get what we need. But I think if you're not even thinking that way, if we're not trying to direct our intent that way, then there'll be absolutely no way we'll ever get there. And so for me, that Horizon 3 is about that deliberate intent, about what seeds of intent am I planting that is going to take us further towards Horizon 3 and away from that keeping the lights on. And they might be very, very small things that you're doing that can have really powerful impacts. And I was just talking with Ramon again in the break, and my little brother, he's not little, he's 6'3", worked for the Department of Corrections for many years doing some of the programs there. And he is just studying to be a clinical psych now. I was reflecting that, you know, how many of the letters they used to send out to people, you've breached, you know. And so they had this man who hadn't been coming to one of their groups, and he thought, well, maybe we'll just write him a letter to see actually what might be going on for him. And this man came into the office because he was absolutely astounded that he got a letter from a government department asking how he was. You know, actually inquiring from a very different positionality about what's happening for you in your life, rather than saying, you know, you haven't done this, we're going to breach you. And I understand, you know, we have to have consequences. But I think, you know, those just different ways of behaving. And as Shane was saying, with the death review work, all the time I'd read things in agency records about people not wanting help, and I think we have a lot of myths. But what I found is that we don't understand people's help seeking or their approaches. It wasn't a lack of asking for help, it was our lack of ability to recognise that and to provide help. So we have our set of responses that are often not helpful. So rather than reflect and think, actually, what I have to offer is not helpful, we say that person doesn't want our help. And so these are the small things that we can change, and there is something you can change in the way, there'll be things that you take from today that would change the way that you interact with each other and with people. And so I guess that's what I'm just trying to say. If we're going to aim there, we have to at least start planting those seeds of intention. Sorry, I don't know if that's... Okay.
Someone asked me one day what I did, and I said, I grow humans. They went, what? I said, I'm lucky. I grow humans. And they said, no, seriously, what do you do? I said, that's what I do. I'm in the business of growing humanoids. And they kind of went, are you serious? And I said, I'm very serious. It takes time. That's really all the water is for the analogy, is time. And it takes a wee bit of care. And I've always thought, and by the way, I understand this idea of having high expectations of others and having high expectations of the people I work with when they don't have high expectations of themselves. And at the same time, kind of getting your guts kicked in. But that actually, and I know this is weird, it makes me hope more. It makes me more optimistic at a time when I think for years, and this is one of the things I wanted to say earlier, but kept my mouth shut. I think we in this society have accepted that there should be certain amounts of collateral damage from the policies that we have allowed, both Labour and National, to flourish. And so either side are both guilty of the same thing in regards to neoliberalism. And we've allowed the poor to be on the scrap heap and suffer from all kinds of things. The reason I like people who tell me to get effed is because I see resistance, and I love it. I'm sick of this term resilience. Resilience is a cop-out that just says, I accept this crap, and somehow this is good. That is absolute rubbish. And so I think now about us and the way that we are resisting what we are learning now. And as you can tell, I am grated. And so whenever I get the opportunity, no matter who it is, if it's a minister or even, I nearly had a crack at the Prime Minister, but I thought it would be too rude. She was on the same plane as me. This is on her last trip when she went overseas. And as she was coming down the aisle, she kind of looked at me, and I was kind of thinking, do I jump up now and say, you're doing a good job. Please make sure you've got carry through. And then I thought, no, shut up. And by the way, at 5 in the morning, she looks elegant. I've never seen someone look elegant in pajamas, but she did. Sorry, back to this.
So I guess what we're just talking about is you've got to be intentional of how we're trying to pattern change, and it's recognising that intent. And you're all partners with each other in the ways that you're working in organisations and ISR, outside of those contexts. And so I think drawing on what Blair was saying is having a conversation, well, what does this partnership look like? Actually in our partnership, is what we're proposing to do, how is that taking us towards Horizon 3? Or is this actually going to take us back to Horizon 1? So I guess it's just trying to hold those multiple viewpoints at once and, asking those questions. And we need to make those spaces to ask those questions, to think about, because we are often stuck in that firefighting. And we know that that's not how we transform lives. And a lot of the ways that we work unintentionally fragment people. And that's not a criticism of the people working, but recognising, as I was saying, how often our structures that we work within dehumanise the way that we actually act. And so I think we all need to be asking these questions and not waiting for someone else or waiting for someone in the funding and planning or commissioner or someone with more power, because the more conversations we start questioning, and that's why I'm really into problematizing rather than problem solving, is actually questioning the assumptions that underlie things, is actually how is that problem represented? And is that really the problem we're trying to address? Because often part of that Western way of thinking is let's problem solve, let's fix this. How are we going to fix this? Rather than thinking about, do I even know what we're actually trying to do, or have I even heard what's been happening for these people? And what is the ways which are actually going to be helpful? So I think try and problematize things. Actually think about, is one problem being represented another way? And I'll share an example. I used to work at the Health Quality and Safety Commission, and they've done a lot of great work, particularly around safe sleeping. But sometimes I think we can use a message that doesn't necessarily address the issues. And so if you're saying to people every baby needs to have a safe sleep, and I've just become a mum, sleep on their back, all these things. But often what we're not addressing is, why is this person living in their car? How helpful is that, someone giving a safe sleep message? I don't even have a safe place to be with my baby. And so we're so very good at giving these messages out and, here's a peppy pod or here's this, when we haven't even understood, so you're sleeping in a garage. And so actually what we need to do is actually find a safe place for you to be. So we're, often the issue we think we're addressing is, a safe sleep message, when actually I think a lot of what we're talking around is actually inequity. And it's actually a housing issue. It's actually lots of other issues. And so that's what I mean is, do you really know what the problem is that you're trying to address? Have you really questioned the assumptions? Because often problems are represented one way, but they can be seen a very, very different way. And far more what would be helpful is actually addressing the practical needs that people have, to be warm, to be healthy, to be happy, to feel free from danger, to feel connected. And so those are the things that we need to be doing in our work. And so that's not a critique of those safe messages, but really thinking, what is my role here? And actually, how can I be of help? And I think that's, for me, having worked in the public service, I'm here to serve the public. How can I be of help? And so that's what I need to learn. So I just pop this quote up. I love bell hooks, and I just think one of the things, if we're going to be transformative, is we have to work addressing multiple forms of violence. And I don't know if we've been that great. Some areas are really good at that, some aren't. And I think this is something which I've been thinking a lot about. You've probably heard that term, wicked problems. We say family violence is a wicked problem, meaning it's really complex, it's really hard to address. And so we've done a lot of talking about family violence as a wicked problem. But tackling racism is a wicked problem as well. And so are we going to have a completely different approach for tackling racism as we would tackling family violence? But if we're really actually going to address violence within whānau, then we need to address racism. We need to address the way that often in government we've marginalised Māori decision making, and there's such high levels of institutional racism. So really what I'm saying is, how do we move to Horizon 3? A lot of that for me is working in an intersectional manner, is actually holding multiple forms of violence that we're actually going to be addressing. I think that's something in some of the areas I worked, I don't think I've been very good at that, and I don't think maybe this sector has been really good at. So if we're thinking about, we're really good at coming out for White Ribbon Day, we've got White Ribbon Day ambassadors. I'm living in New Plymouth at the moment, which is a very racist community, and I was just thinking how often we see very negative things in the media. So people remember the Chiefs, and there was the sexualised violent behaviour towards a young woman, and there's a scandal. And so a lot of people coming out saying, this is really terrible, abhorrent behaviour. The rugby board needs to do something about this. And so we're good at that. How good are we, and this is just reflecting on the community I'm in, how good are we as allies in the family violence sector when there's things like blackface at the Hawara AMP show saying we don't stand for that. We're going to speak out against that form of violence as well. And so part of this work for me being transformative is actually we need to speak out against multiple forms of violence, because people's lives are often, as you struggle, at the point of resistance between multiple forms of oppression. And so for me, transformation is we have to address all these forms of violence in our communities, otherwise we're not going to get there. And that's why I just love Audre Lorde. There is no hierarchy of oppressions. And so this is something I'd be thinking about what does this look like in our work? How good are we addressing other forms of violence? Or have we got a bit of a hierarchy of oppressions of how we work?
And by the way, generally if you ask someone if they're oppressed, they'll go, "What?" Do you know what I mean? It's not something that's had as a conversation. So how do we deal with it in terms of the way that we are viewing our own thinking? Because I completely agree with Rachel. And I guess it's this notion here. Māori young men aren't born with F the world tattooed on their fingers. You know what I mean, don't you? Yeah, they're not. And yet, we see a predominance of them with similar kinds of tattoos. And so how did that become? How did that happen? And for me, I look at the multiple forms of hurt and dehumanization that takes place. Because here's the thing about dehumanization. It dehumanizes both the oppressed and the oppressor. And I've read a number of writers on this, and they all say the same thing. If the path forward for the oppressed has to come out of the heart and mind of the oppressed, anything else is just false generosity. Can I say that again? When we start to get into a hierarchy of oppressions, what we end up with, coming out with, is these kind of piecemeal programs that those people themselves know are false generosity. And I think we have to start to question that and start to want the long game as a society. And no, I'm not interested in politics. This is not a political statement. This is a personal statement about what I think is necessary in our society so that we can start treating one another as fully human. Because for me, that's the end game. It's seeing the true beauty in other people. And seeing, I've just had the privilege of seeing so many people kind of give up drugs and walk away from violence and all that kind of thing, because they kind of clicked in just a little way at Horizon 3. They figured out what they could be. And sure, the steps were incremental, and a lot of them were backwards. How do you say to someone who's a youth worker for you, and they come and go, "Oh, bro, I went tripping last night. I guess I'm not very good at youth work." And I'm going, actually, man, the fact that we're talking about it's a good start. The fact that you're being honest here for me speaks tons. And no, I'm not going to just leave you hanging here. You can walk away from this if you like, but actually, I want to have a conversation with you every day. And let's find out why you still want to go tripping. You know what I mean? And by the way, that person is me. That's what a manager of an organisation once said to me when I was struggling. And I decided that being straight and hanging around with people like that was just so boring. And I just wanted to get smashed. And I went and had that conversation with him. And it was, for me, long-term Horizon 3 stuff. Someone who said, actually, let's work this out and see if we can figure out why you want to do this. It's a bit like the letter that was sent from corrections. How is it with you? Kia ora, I love that.
Now, we will be sending out the slides because there are a couple of links to the TED Talks that I think would be really good if anyone wants to watch. And Kimberly Crenshaw came up with this term intersectionality in 1983, and it's kind of a really clunky term, I guess, because it sounds like one of those big jargon words, and what does that actually mean, and what does that mean for the way that I am with people. And she's got this great TED Talk from 2016, and she's talking about how, particularly in America, the names that are known around state violence towards African Americans are men's names. And so the community know the men that have been killed through state violence. by police. But there have been a lot of women, a lot of young women, middle-aged women, older women, who have also been killed. But people do not know their names. And so she has part of this work called Say Her Name. And so what she started doing when she's right back in the 80s is saying, you know, we've got two roads. We've got she saw gender discrimination and equity, and she's a law professor. You know, we know how to respond to that. So we have an ambulance that if you're being discriminated against around gender, they'll send the gender ambulance. So that comes, and then they had an ambulance around racism that could come out and address racism. But the intersection, particularly for black women, between racism and sexism, there was no ambulance that addressed that. So you either have to choose one or the other. And so this is what she's trying to get us to understand, that often our responses, they're kind of single-laned, and the intersections that people's lives live within, resist against, we don't meet. And so often, that's what I'm saying, we have to turn the gaze back on ourselves and say, you know, what sort of questions are we actually asking that I'd even understand what might be happening for people? And so even though it's a really big clunky term, and I often, when I talk about intersectionality, people sort of glaze over or think about, oh, how, you know, what does that mean? I think maybe someone's got to come up with a better term. In her TED talk, she talks about, you know, the intersection of the roads. That's why she came up with that word intersectionality. But I think it's really, really important because we can't be transformative just working around family violence. That is understanding that, you know, our dominant social pattern of harm is men's violence towards women. But intersectionality is not asking us to stop addressing that. It's actually asking us to look at other patterns of harm and that also intersect. And so a lot of our work, I think, has been based on Western feminism, which hasn't acknowledged its positionality. And I'm standing here, you know, having learnt this at university, being a Western white privileged Pākehā woman standing up here and thinking about actually what we're doing is harmful, and we're actually designing systems that address one part of someone's life and eclipse complete other people's lives. And so this is what we need to be thinking about when I'm saying, as a collaborative, I don't know how you behave when there's really overtly racist comments made in the media, whether as a family violence collaborative people come out and actually say, you know, we don't support this, things like that, or do we just come out when there's violence against women in the media and behaviour which is abhorrent around sexism? And so this is where I guess it's, you know, thinking about how we being. And as I was saying, having moved to New Plymouth to try get away from work actually, in the best possible way, I thought I need to be a mum and I wanted time to be a mum. So I removed myself from Wellington, and which is not my home anyway. And I don't know if anyone's heard of Andrew Judd. Anyone? Yeah? And so obviously he was the ex-mayor of New Plymouth, and we had 23% of people used to come out and vote in the, you know, general council elections, but 83% of the population came out to vote down a Māori ward, and so which he was proposing. And you know, he's been spat on the street, and you know, experiencing the racism that people experience every single day. But he's got a really good talk about becoming a recovering racist, and so I think there's forms of violence that we might not be so good about talking about, and how do we actually, if we're going to be transformative, start to talking about that. And that comes back to power and acknowledging where our power is, and how we behave and balance our power and our love. And so there's a TED talk there that if you want to watch, I would say it's really good, and he gets twice the amount of fan mail as hate mail. But we need people who start to talk about actually this is the change that we want to see and be really honest about it. Which moves me on to, and then I'll stop talking for a bit, one of our problems, a lot of people, we've done trauma-informed care. People heard trauma-informed care, very, very popular idea. But when we're talking about that frame of reference, it's still really narrow. And if you read a lot of people's work, like Leonie Pihama, she'll say that trauma-informed care doesn't even address Māori experiences of historical trauma, is often very individualised. It doesn't address collective forms of violence. And so if we're going to start shifting our frame of reference, taking a wider approach, seeing more forms of violence that we can address, I think a practical way of doing this is through trauma and violence-informed care, where we actually start to look at systemic forms of violence as well as interpersonal. So that then requires the organisation you work within to think about, are there practices which support ways of stigmatising people that come to our service, come in our door, that we might need to change. Because I think often we have these ways of looking like trauma-informed care, what trauma happened to someone, it's individualising, and it doesn't make us also think about what might our role be, unintentionally, I'm not saying that people are intentionally, of re-traumatising and continuing that by the practices that we do, the forms that we use. And we have all these business as usual ways of working. When you work in the health, there's this form you fill out and there's that form and there's got this code on it. And often what we don't find is we don't find ways of writing down all the structural forms of violence that people are experiencing. Like I know I used to work in ADHB around the family violence. It sort of asked me around family violence. I don't sort of write round other forms of violence. So, I'm not saying that these are easy things to do, but if we're going to talk about being compassionate, showing empathy, actually really wanting to hear and being prepared to hear, and actually asking people to trust us to hear what's happening for them, we actually need to be making sure we address what people are sharing with us. And I think a lot of the ways that we work eclipse that, and they don't support us to do that work well.
My wife, and her name is Helen. We've been in love since we were 16, and we are best friends through thick and thin. But often when I get upset when I see something racist in the news or anything like that, and I kind of get on my high horse at the table, she'll go, "Stop collapsing your analysis down into one thing. You're far more sophisticated than that. What are the other factors at play here?" By the way, she's a good debater and she loves physics. I mean, she just drives me nuts. But she's absolutely right. Our analysis for this has to be a little bit more sophisticated. We have to start viewing things. And I agree with Rachel on this. I think, for me, trauma and violence-informed care is a much better way of looking at it, because for me the latter makes us look at not just individualised or community or whānau things, but makes us look at those broader things. I think for too long we've accepted that this is normal. Well, I'm sorry, but I go to places where this is not normal, where human beings decide as a country to behave to one another in much better ways. We are one of the wealthiest countries on earth. By virtue of you being here, you are in the top 15% of the population of the earth. If you have a degree from a university, you are in the top 5% worldwide. And yet, we still accept some of this collateral damage, and we allow human beings to become refuse. My wife's right. Don't have such a clumsy kind of one-hit analysis. And so I'm very careful now when I get on my high horse. When I see something on TV, I'll go, "It's this, but it could also be this, this, and this." And that's really about those eyes of hers that are piercing at me, because she's right. We have to be sophisticated in our analysis for this. And it's like my daughter. She, when she was at school, one of her classmates, whenever the teacher would go to tell this guy off, and he was often misbehaving in class, and his answer was always, "Oh, you hate me because I'm black, miss." And he would say that, and it would shut her down, and the teacher would get shut down. And so one day my daughter went to the teacher and just said, look, you've got to stop this. Tell him he's a little shit. and say, you don't hate him because he's black, but his behaviour is pissing us all off. And I said, how'd you go? And she said, look, the teacher did it. The behaviour stopped. Multiple analysis, a bit smarter. And if a 14-year-old can learn that and then go and do it in her classroom and see the classroom change and see the teacher change, I can't see why we can't.
Kia ora. So as you said, we're going to send these slides out. I'm not going to labour through it, but I guess it's thinking if you might be trauma-informed care in your workplace, what does adding violence to that, multiple forms of violence, mean? How would that require you to practice differently? What does that mean to think about? Often the way we find out, customer satisfaction forms, pre-developed evaluations of our services. How do we really know what people's experiences actually are of our services? And those are some of the words that remain with me when having done the death review work. When you read people's different statements they've given different agencies, but what actually really hurt them, saying things like, that person made me feel small, insignificant and stupid. And actually, who do you think was right, the professional or the person asking for help? And so we are so good at demonising people and often judging that people wouldn't know the right thing without really thinking about, the way that we work and how is it to come into our place where we work? What does that actually look like? You're talking about the warm eyes. Would people get that feeling of warm eyes when they come into our workplace? And these are really hard things to do because, as you were saying, we work in a busy emergency department. But I think we can always do things differently. First of all, we have to open our minds to be able to do that. And so some of the things that we can change, and for people who have heard me talk before, I often do talk about language because I always think of Moana Jackson, who says, words have the power to define and to protect. And so, what is the language we actually use? So if we're talking about being respectful, working with aroha, working in a way that is transparent, about keeping people informed. It's not about sharing information. It's about actually working with people to bring understanding to people's lived experiences, what we often call sharing information. And so what we share is often probably not what we'd necessarily be proud of, because when you get into that business as usual approach, that managerial approach, and this is the problem, family violence, forms of violence become business as usual. Our language changes. Non-compliant patient. Do we say unsuitable care? Or do we actually think, actually our help isn't that helpful? Maybe we should be thinking about the way that we respond, and that was one of the key themes that came through time and time again. I'd read records where people say, I'll use my own name, Rachel needs to want our help. And you're thinking, actually this is someone who is homeless, who has no safe place to live, who's struggling with multiple issues in their life. To expect someone to come to an appointment at a certain time, and if you didn't turn up to that appointment, we offer you one more, and after that, off the books, because you don't want help. And so I guess that's when I'm saying problematize. What does wanting help look like? What does wanting help mean in our language? What is wanting help? Because often we have a very, very narrow definition and way of behaving, that if you don't fit in that box, then you didn't want help. And that's the lasting memory with me. I used to, look and see someone's disclosed 18 times. That to me is not wanting help. That's a very, very different story is emerging there. And so there's a reference here around trauma and violence informed care that talks about some things that organisations can do. So it might be having a look at that. Does any of this make sense? Is any of this helpful? If it's not, that's okay, but at least take the opportunity.
I agree with Rachel on this one. I think the language and how we use language is so important. So, just briefly, could you turn to your neighbour, or the person closest to you, and talk about the words that you use. And I'll put this in broad terms. What do you use instead or do you use the word client? And what goes with that language? If you use the word client, what does that mean? I know Māori will use terms like tangata whai ora and a whole number of other things. But do you use the term client, or what language do you use for that word? So, please, what are your words for the people you work with? It's great.
Definitely do that.
Yep.
I'll just click over that.
Yep. And get to, we can get to this one.
Click over. There's no things to that.
I'll speak to that briefly. Yep.
And then we'll just leave them with that. So
Yep.
actually, hit the spots.
Yep. Okay. Yeah. No. I think we probably we can easily use another 15 minutes. Yeah. By the way, I hate doing fire.
It's so easy. You become
Except I was in a German shop the other day buying shirts, and this guy took charge of me, measured me up, and started finding me shirts, and I bought 7. Never, unheard of. I never buy clothes like that. Never. And he went up to the counter and said, "This is my client."
transaction. You're paying money for a product. Maybe in that context it's okay.
Yeah, but he got a bonus because of all the sales. Yeah. Okay. Look, the language that we use in our thinking about other people can, in my view, give them possibilities. I struggle with the term client just because it has real power differentials and all that kind of thing. What are some of the other terms you use for the people that you have the privilege of working with? Oh yeah, white peace, yeah. Is that a swear word? Sorry. Yeah. So getting down to those, kind of getting people down into a set of letters. What else do you use? Offender? Yep. Yeah. People who sometimes get involved with behaviour that can be offensive. Because if that's the case, then I'm definitely an offender. What else? Their name. Yeah. Their name. I just want to introduce the idea that how we do this is important. But also, I put on this notion of our lenses. Rachel and I have the privilege of being here to serve you in this purpose. But actually, the most learning for you long term will probably come from the person beside you. And I want to encourage you to consider continuing these kōrero, considering the way that you know each other and can grow one another. The times when I don't know if you know anything, some of you have been students here, that I've had the privilege of having as students. But most of you will know that my double act at the university is Anaru Ekatoni. And him and I back each other up to the bone. And if I can't be at a meeting, he is at a meeting. If I can't answer a question, he has permission to answer on my behalf. And by the way, him and I also have an obligation that we are not allowed to say yes to anything without us first discussing it. We don't even have that obligation with our wives, but we have it with each other as colleagues. And so, I consider, look, start thinking about one another's destinies and the way that we look after each other. Social work and work in the human services is good at stabbing its wounded. The number of times I've seen wounded lynched when they should have been loved, when in a profession that espouses human rights and social justice, we say that someone got burned out and went off the rails. Part of that is we stopped caring for them. And so please, how we treat the people we work with often is a reflection of how we treat each other. I once said in a gathering, put me in a room full of people who murder people, and I'm in my element. Put me in a room of social workers and I want to kill someone. What does that say about us as a profession? It says we need to take some of our own advice.
So we've spoken a lot today about how we work with people, but maybe not so much how we work with each other, the people sitting next to you, your colleagues, friends, partners that you work with every day. And I just wanted to share this slide because I see myself, I've been very good at the debating. And often there's multiple forms the way that we listen and talk. And this all comes back to how we use power. So how often in a meeting are we sort of asserting what we think is right and what needs to be done and sort of overusing that power drive? And, the truth is, and there's only one way of doing things, and this is best practice, and the evidence says this, and, that's how it's going to be. And so in a way, you're just listening to have things that confirm your own way of seeing and doing, listening to your own story. You're not interested in hearing about other ways of doing things. And so this is typical behaviour of experts, fundamentalists, and dictators. And I think we will see ourselves, I can see myself, have been in all these different positions, thinking, I'm right, and people just need to listen to me. And then we've got another way, which is debating, which is a bit like being in the courtroom. This is correct, that's not correct. And then how do we move to dialoguing, which is far more self-reflexive, thinking about what might be happening for other people, trying to get more a sense of holism. But really what we want to be getting to is actually being present. And that's what is meant by presenting. And I wanted to share something which I thought of fitted this way of being. And you'll notice that I've got sort of pictures which from Google. But the last picture, what I'm noticing here and now, which is around holism, is actually a picture of Karina Walters. And I don't know if people know Karina Walters. She has done a lot of work in Canada, in the States. She is an expert on Indigenous wellness. And really what she's been doing here in this picture is rewalking the Trail of Tears. So she's from the Choctaw Nation, and obviously her people's land was taken from them and they were forcibly removed and sent to reservations. And so this was a trauma trail, the Trail of Tears as it's known. And so what she wanted to do in addressing diabetes, and so this is a very different way of seeing things and a way of engaging multiple forms of violence, is she re-walked this Trail of Tears with health officials and people who are involved in this wellness program from the community. And so this is what she had to say. It is not about the trauma of the Trail of Tears, but getting connected with the vision of love and life that our ancestors had. There is something about physically being on the trail. Our people laughed, lived, loved on the trail. It was almost like a vow-making ceremony. Walter said of the commitment made by participants, the guiding questions are, what kind of ancestor would my ancestors want me to be? What kind do I want to be? And what kind of ancestors will future generations be? It is stepping into our roles as leaders. And so when I thought about, well, what does transformation look like in practice, that's what I'm thinking. That's what we need to be doing. How are we going to step into our roles as leaders in this work? And how do we actually move around so we're actually hearing and open to hearing what other people are saying? We're actually able to be present. But we're doing that with actually a vision of where we want to be going together. And as I say, I am very good at the debating. And so this is probably more a reflection of myself than something for yourselves. But thinking about, if we're talking about collaboration, what does that really look like? What are the questions that are guiding our collaboration? And what is the vision of what we're trying to do and when we're collaborating? And so I'm aware that we're probably over our time, which is not a surprise. And so I'm going to just click through a couple of slides.
No, we've got plenty of time.
Have we? Okay, I'll pass the lunchtime. I'm going to go on to this slide for
Look,
Shane.
Michael Hart has the Chair for Indigenous Research and Social Work for Canada. He's a good mate of mine. We've published some papers together. But on top of all of that, he's a stunning guy. And so he came up with this notion of Indigenous practice. And you may ask, what does he mean by Indigenous? And what he is really talking about is an honourable place for non-Indigenous people to work with Indigenous people. And he's basically saying, if you want to step up to the plate and work with us, there are some things that go with this. And he's saying, look, we want your help, but we don't want it in an ill-informed way. We want it in a way that acknowledges particular things. And the first thing he talks about is how we as Indigenous people, or we as Māori, exist in the world. What are some of the ways of being in our world? So what are some of the things that are important to us? And so, Matthew, thank you for upholding the mana of everyone here and ensuring that we had a wairua that was fit for purpose for this. Because otherwise, I couldn't have stayed. And so, thank you for arranging this, because it's part of a way of being in the world. And what underpins that is particular values and beliefs. And I quite often hear students, they'll say, I use whare tapawhā. And I'll go, break it down. What does it mean? And they'll go, like the four walls and bloody, bloody, blah. And I'll go, break it down even further. What do those individual things mean in behaviour? Because once you start to unpack that, you're starting to unpack values and beliefs. And one of the things I think about cultural growth is that it's a cup that we can just keep pouring more and more into. I love landing in other countries and seeing what their food's like and seeing what their people are like. It's the two things I judge a country on. If the place is beautiful, that's a bonus. But it's the food and the people that make a difference for me. And I think that as we start to understand Indigenous values and beliefs in far more sophisticated ways and start to compare them with who we are and the things that we hold important, we're starting to get a place where we don't practice from a point of guilt, but we practice from a point of strength. And so I can't stand it when someone turns up and does kind of Māori things from a position of guilt. And I see it all the time. I also see these things taught in an emotionally blackmailing way. And I'm not into that either, because I think it's just as bad. I think, and it's interesting that as a country we are starting to have this debate about teaching a true history of Aotearoa. Oh mate, it's enlightened. I cannot wait for it. I think it's going to be great. And there'll still be a portion of our society that wants to sweep that stuff under the carpet. But my wife did a year, my daughter did a year in Germany and went to school there. And she came back more Māori than what she went. I thought she would come back European. I was so worried that I would lose her. And she came back staunchly wanting to be Māori. And I said, "What did it, babe?" And she said, "Dad, they're so honest about their history. They know what has gone on there. They're far more honest than we are about our history." Unusual observation from a 16-year-old. But anyway, you may not think that some of those stories or narratives or so-called myths that you've heard are theoretical. Actually, in Māori worldviews, they're highly theoretical. And so I encourage you to start looking at Indigenous theories. One of the most important parts of Michael Hart's approach is this next part: Indigenous ways of coming to know things. And I want to encourage you in this, because this does not just apply to Indigenous people. It applies to any people group. The other day, I got my daughter over before I was leaving for overseas, and I said, "Babe, can you help me sort out my phone? I want to record some CDs and put them on my phone so I can listen to my music." And she said, "Dad, I put Spotify on your phone 2 years ago." And I went, "Babe, what's Spotify?" And so she showed me how to use Spotify. And so now I'm in Spotify heaven. So because I can listen to whatever I want and I know what it is. And who'd have thought it was so simple? And I had it the whole time. You know, didn't even know it. And so I want to challenge you. How are the people we are working with coming to know things now? Because it's not the same as when it was when we were their age. The people we are working with now are coming to know things in different ways. And so things that I feel clunky in, you know, like Facebook and online stuff, all that kind of stuff is now normal for ways of coming to know. And so I'm trying to think, how are the ways that we can treat people as fully human that are 21st century? Because I think our ways of doing that are changing. And we need to catch up, because it may not be that you can sit down with someone and go, you know, "Tell me about things. How's things going in your day?" You know, that might be an affront to this human being, because it may not be how this human being relates now. It may be that we meet in a cafe, or the person says, "Do you play Deathcom 5? I don't even know what that is, by the way. And I'll go, "No, teach me." You know what I mean? There are a whole lot of other ways of doing that now. And so one of the important things for me is figure out how the people we are with come to know things. And what Michael Hart says very strongly is, if you take care of those things, then the practice will come naturally in our lives. And that's the bit I love. You know, a model means nothing, but day-to-day practice that acknowledges other cultures and ways of viewing the world, to me that means a lot long-term. And so, most of you, is anyone, well, I'll state it again. One of my kind of favourite humanoids in the world is Mātua Taina. Have any of you met him? Do you know Taina Pohatu? He's a stunning, humble, lovely man. And he wrote a paper called Ata, Growing Respectful Relationships. And really what ATA is about is having applied principles that make us consider the way that we are having relationships. And in social work practice now, we have become quite open to some of the things that Matua was talking about. And so he says we need to be thinking about our relationships, how we negotiate boundaries, how we create spaces in which people can be with us and speak with us, and to gently remind people about how we are behaving and considering others. And so it's about space and time. It's about effort and energy. It's about that notion of respectfulness, and more importantly for me, reciprocity. The people in the room can contribute something. And today, you have all been reciprocal with each other. You have all been contributing to one another's learning, and you have contributed to ours. It conveys this idea that we have to be reflective. But at the same time, having a critical analysis doesn't mean that we spout on for ages and become undisciplined. It also means that sometimes the most disciplined thing that I can do is shut up. And my friends will tell you, they know when I'm having to work on this. And I'll tell you, I've had to develop a strategy for it. This is serious. I do this in meetings. If you see me do this, that means I am sitting on my hands to make myself shut up and listen. Because I may think I have a solution or an answer, but that's not what those people need. They need to come to that themselves. So if I'm sitting on my hands, that is reminding me to shut up. If I am doing this, that means I'm really struggling with it. But I've had to physically make myself do it because I'm so used to being in environments like this where I'm in charge and people listen to me. And actually that doesn't work. When people require change and growth and all that kind of thing, they need for us to be using these. I wonder why we got 2 of these and 1 of these, and why this one is the hardest to discipline.
I do have the same problem, and I think that's why looking at, being present, walking together, what does that actually mean? So just a couple of things which we want to wrap up today's morning conversation with you all before we hear from He Wakatapu and all the wonderful work that they're doing, is focusing on that word ally and what does it mean to be an ally. And Shane and I were with Blair on the expert design group for the Family Violence, Sexual Violence and Violence Within whānau framework. And what we were trying to do in that space, and there's still a lot more work to do, is actually come up with a new language of safety. Because often when we think about safety, it might have a time limit on it, whereas safety for me is timeless. Because it is actually addressing trauma and violence histories of multiple people. It is actually making sure that you're moving to that place where people are actually able to be restorative and transformative, and so there isn't a time limit on safety. Safety is a concept that I think we have shrunk. And so we were trying to define what being a safety ally meant, because so much of the work which we saw in the death review space was when women were asking for help, they'd be given a list of actions that they could go out and do. And that's a generalisation. And so it was giving advice without having even asked any questions. And so here we are, you can go get a protection order, you can do this, you can do that, you can do that. Is any of that helpful? And so we were thinking about how do you be in partnership with someone, not having power over telling them what to do, when so often we haven't even understood that people would have tried to do these things multiple times and would be able to tell us why they don't work. So if we haven't even listened to that or even comprehended that, then we're not able to be a safety ally. And so what we're wanting you to think about is, in your work, how can you be transformation allies? And so really what we're talking about here is allies across multiple forms of violence. What would that actually look like? how would that change your behaviours as a collective and who you're partnering with? As I said, a lot of us in this room, probably the main sector we may work within might be family violence. We have people from the sexual violence sector, people working with violence within whānau, but how many people here, their main work is around anti-racism, anti-oppression work. And so if we are going to get to that third horizon, we need to be allies across all these forms of violence, like we need to have an intersectional way of understanding. Intersectionality doesn't ask us to look at people, it actually asks us to look back at ourselves and our own organisations and understand the structures and systems and ways of working that marginalise people. So it's not looking at marginalised people, but how we are complicit often in that process of marginalisation. And so it was just getting you to talk to the person next to you, or you can get up and move and think about what might be something you're going to take away today, one way of being that could be transformative and is moving us towards being an ally rather than being in this, customer service managerial mindset. And so get you to talk with the people near you.
Okay, I think Kai is ready, eh? And so, just as we are finishing off, we've put up this notion of kia puawai, and it's this notion of starting to view violence within whānau as also an opportunity for blossoming, as also an opportunity for growth. One of my favourite writers is a man called Dennis Salibi. And Dennis Salibi, his book is on its 9th edition, and he's famous for his work on strength-based approaches. And depending on our view of trauma and how we look at it with a person. And can I stress that? How we look at it with someone, not at someone, but with someone, decides in his view how we will work with them. And so I don't view trauma as the end game. I view it as an opportunity. I don't view anyone as being beyond redemption. And I don't say that lightly, because I've had at least 3 people live with me who have gone on to end other people's lives. And so I view them as people who still deserve restoration and still can be transformed. And so I once had a cop say to me, "Why do you hang around with scum like that?" And I said, "If you're asking a question like that, mate, should you still be a cop?" And he kind of looked at me, and I was serious. Because in the view we have of others, it's actually a reflection of the view we have of ourselves. And I see myself as having a lot of hope. I see myself as still having possibilities. I'm still trying to figure out what I'm going to do when I grow up. Seriously. But here's a word about this. We have to practice what we preach. I've just dropped 22 kgs. I'll tell you why. I was worried about my daughter. And my wife said to me, "She's only eating like the way you eat," which is you don't care. If you want it to work for her, then do something about it. And so while I was overseas, she emailed me and she said, "Dad, I've lost 5 kgs. It starts with us in our homes. If we truly want to change family violence as a nation, we will have a conversation as a family or a whānau, and we will ask, what is a coercive relationship? And by the way, they're rife in middle-class families. Don't for one moment think that your whānau is immune to this. So what is a coercive relationship? 2, when is violence ever okay? Ever. 3, who in our whānau do we go to talk to if we are subject to this behaviour, whether it is in the workplace or within us as a whānau? And 4, what are our strategies for doing something about it? And in my whānau, I suit up and I get in there, and they know I am serious when I turn up in a suit. It's a weird and wanky thing, but people think you are serious and mean when you put on a suit, and it works every time. And by the way, we had that conversation as a whānau because I was really unhappy for one of my children and one of the relationships that she was in. And it was just so magical, the way in which she came to me one day and she said, "Dad, can you come and pick me up?" I said, "What do you mean?" She goes, "Actually, we've decided we're no good for each other." I went, "What?" And she said, "No, seriously, we love each other, but actually, we're no good for each other. We are causing so much harm." And it was, for me, a piece of magic. Please, I don't look outside for this. And I'm not doing it in a way that says it's not an issue for me or us. I think these things are issues for all of us. And as a nation, we have to have honest conversations. I challenge you at Christmas time, especially after you've got the spirits out. Yeah. Wine first, maybe a beer, and then you start getting into the single malts. Have this conversation, and you will be shocked at the honesty. But please, be prepared to act. I think it starts with each one of us. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Shane and Rachel. Thank you so much. I think there's some discussions that my hope would be you've kick-started them. They're not new, but that between us here, there'll be conversations that we intentionally carry on together. You would have seen the outline today. I think most of you will have that. At the end of the day, after the afternoon, we'll have a panel, so Rachel and Shane will still be here and have a bit of a question and answer time. We'll stick to the time frame. Lunch, we're a little bit overdue. That was partly because there was a short order on the lunch, so there's possibly, are we good? Sweet. Needed some time to send out the Batmobile and get sushi. But it's all good now. Dawn, I'll ask you to bless the sky and then, choice. Thanks much. I know you don't. Just made me walk here.